The question that you have to answer yourself, is this your forever home? And if it is your forever home where you're going to live here for 20, 30, 40 years, going to retire here, then overcapitalizing it makes sense. If it's not your forever home, make sure that you don't overcapitalize and give yourself a buffer. It's very important to understand how the banks work, understand where the money is going to come from. All of these scenarios needs to play out. And how is your investment strategy going to excel from where you are versus where you're going to go? Hello and welcome to Helpmebuy Property Podcast. Today we are going to talk about key life decisions that are going to impact your investment journey or property investment lifecycle. We are going to talk about your first property, whether it be your investment property or principal place of residence, the first home buyer's grant, and how to not overcapitalize to ensure that you can continue your property investment lifecycle. We'll talk about rent vesting, we'll talk about guarantors, we'll talk about buying a property with a relative or a friend, getting married, having kids, and so all of these fun stuff. And how does that impact your property investment lifecycle? Stay tuned. Thank you very much. Let's invite, drum roll, Cheryl to our podcast. Cheryl, my co-host. Cheryl, how are you today?
I am amazing as always, Moss. Love this topic so much because I don't think it gets talked about enough to really go, what happens at each stage of your life? So, let's dive into it.
Definitely. And it's one of those things that happens to every one of us and we never tend to think about it. It's very reactive. I see people asking these questions all the time that, what happens if I make this X life decisions and, how do I navigate through some of these things? And so we are going to talk about all of these crazy life decisions that happens in everyone's life and how do you navigate them through, or what decisions that people need to make when they're talking about or taking some of these life decisions.
I was going to say, it can get overwhelming with the amount of information that's out there. And the truth is there's no one size fits all, right? Because when you're starting out, if it's going to be your first property, whether it's an investment or your principal place of residence, we need to, let's start off with that, because then it goes on to when you're married and you're with kids, like that's a different decision that you have around your next steps and all of that. So we're basically almost going to go through a life cycle. And obviously that starts off with buying your very first property. And big thing is around whether you should purchase an investment property or your principal place of residence. And we've previously in another episode talked about rent vesting, which I'm a big fan of. However, there are situations where you want to take advantage of the first home owner's grant. So I know, Moss, you're across all the different types of grants much more than I am in your world. Can you give us some examples of grants that are currently available? And doesn't have to be all of them, just examples of some of them.
Ultimately, when you talk about the first home grants, there are first home buyers grants on, brand new properties. Then there are, government incentivizing schemes for loans where you can, split the loans or get into no LMI loans. Then there are stamp duty concessions available in different states for first home buyers and owner occupiers, together at the same time. Naturally, when a person decides to buy a first home or even a home to live in, a principal place of residence, even if it's not their first home, that impacts their serviceability. And so from an investment perspective, it always is an interesting question, because every time you buy a principal place of residence to live in, there is no income coming against it. The cash outlay is, usually a lot higher, and you are paying principal and interest in majority of these circumstances. And so disposable income drops quite significantly, which means that for a lot of people, their investment journey takes a pause or a backseat for quite some time as soon as they go down the route of buying principal place of residence. How do they go about still making that decision, a crucial decision in their life, while continuing their journey is $1 million question, right?
Yeah. And I'd say, the truth is that looks it's enticing, right? The government says, buy your first property, we'll give you, you shave off all this stamp duty, you shave off all this needing to, you might, will subsidize your first 5%, whatever that is. Again, I'm not across the actual different grants. So it looks like you don't have to spend a lot of money up front. So it is enticing. And admittedly, when I first bought my property, I took advantage of that at the time. I mean, I lived in the property for a few months. I think it was 6 months to a year or so, and then ended up renting it out. So what are your thoughts around that particular strategy, going, all right, I'm going to take advantage of all of these grants, and I'll live there for a little while, but then I might outgrow it and rent it out?
Ultimately, whenever you're going to decide to buy a principal place of residence, your thinking should be that, this is the first time I'm going to buy a principal place of residence, depending on where you are in your life. You might have 1 kid, no kid, 2 kids, 3 kids. And so the question that you have to answer yourself, is this your forever home? And if it is your forever home where you're going to live here for 20, 30, 40 years, going to retire here, then overcapitalizing it makes sense. But if it's not your forever home, make sure that you don't overcapitalize and give yourself a buffer so that you can keep investing in growing your wealth on the side. I have an interesting story for a client that I just recently met, and they bought a property for almost $900,000, moved out from their property in order to renovate it, got the bill for $1 million of renovation, or a quote for $1 million for renovation, decided that renovation was not the right strategy, redesigned the whole thing, wanted to put the house down, build a brand new house. The house was going to cost them $1.6 million. The day before the demo was about to happen, the bank said that, oh, by the way, the GRV doesn't stack up, as is value of the house isn't, we can't give you, 3 million valuation on the house, where, the houses are selling for 2.4, 2.3, 2.2 million. And so they've stripped down the house already. They've rented to another place. They have already made the plans because, they were so much invested. And now 18 months in, they're going back to, doing a basic renovation, moving in. And so it's important. Like it's a really, really tough decision. You have invested yourself into a decision. You haven't thought this through. Your broker was not on the same page, didn't realize how the bank is going to react. And you have committed yourself in spending close to about $150,000, not only in, all these architectural fees, council fees, etc., but also the holding costs, because the house is left empty with no tenants in there. So it's important that you think this through, understand that, don't overcapitalize, make this. And mind you, like, these people are high income earners. They are, right at the top, earning $400,000 a year as a family, right? So, living in a shitty old rentals where there is no gas, not proper electricity, is a lot of frustration. They're like, why are we living like this? We have a property that we can't live in or we can't renovate. We can actually service a $2 million loan, but we are in this sort of conundrum where we try to push ourselves way too much in, trying to build something that was, that wasn't thought through properly. And that's why it's very important to, when you're making this decision, understand how the banks work, understand, where the money is going to come from. All of these scenarios needs to play out. And how is your investment strategy going to excel from where you are versus where you're going to go?
Yeah. And I feel that when we first look at the property to buy at the very start, a lot of us have this hat of, and we've been sold, right? We want to buy the dream house. And I'm talking about most people, they used to, start purchasing properties in their early 20s, but now it's sort of in their sort of 30s, and you might purchase it as a couple or whichever. And we tend to just look at one property at a time. And so you sort of think, I'm going to get my PPOR, principal place of residence. I'm going to max out my serviceability. I've got this beautiful home, which I might live in for a few years. But you raised something previously about serviceability, because what tends to happen is that you do max out your serviceability. You've put all your capital into it. You might have got first homeowners grant for portions, but your serviceability, you were literally waiting for equity in the property. So you're waiting for some capital growth, and then you're waiting for your serviceability to kick in. So then that impacts on your ability to actually go again. And so you literally have to wait and stop. So the flip side is then going, okay, if I don't purchase my PPOR, right, and everyone's going to be a little bit different and have different needs, your first property goes, okay, well, if I purchase an investment, one of the questions that often comes up is, will I still be eligible for the first home owner's grant?
Oh, 100%. Look, you can protect your first home buyer's grant by using trust structures quite evidently. But in majority of the states, if you are going down the route of investment loans for investment property, your first home owner's grant is usually protected. Now, there is slight caveats to this. Let me rephrase this. So the savings that comes with the stamp duty side of things, the stamp duty concessions, okay, those are definitely protected. But the first home buyer's grant, where the states gives you an extra, say, $10,000 for buying a brand new property for the first time, majority of those disappear, but the stamp duty concessions in relation to buying a first home the first time usually stays. This is predominantly Victoria and a lot of the other states. And so, there are little tricks of how do you define and classify first home buyer's grant as well. There are various different subsets to first home buyers. And so some of them would still be available, the others would not be available. What you can do is you can protect them completely by buying a property in a trust. And because the trust has a complete legal separate standing, your overall first home buyer's grant basically gets protected. And so, those are some of the key things that you should consider when you're, taking this direction.
Yeah. Right. So we've addressed your decision, first property, whether it's an investment, whether it's PPOR. We've highlighted a few things to keep note of. So if you purchase as an investment, probably doesn't affect your first home buyer's grant. If you're going to go down that path, make sure that you have a long-term view of your property strategy. It's really important. I know at the time you're so excited, you want to buy your first property. Make sure you have a long-term view, because what you purchase will impact your ability to purchase more. So another thing, and when we're talking about first properties, again, there is a wider acceptance of purchasing with a relative or a friend. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yes, it's not usually for the first home. I mean, yes, it is for the first home as well, but it's also, buying these for investment properties. You hear all the time that, I want to build my investment property portfolio with a friend or a relative because, we combine the forces together and we can do a lot more. Understand from a bank's perspective, it's very, very important to highlight it from a bank's perspective, how this works. From a bank's perspective, when two people come to the bank together on, buying an investment property, say $400,000 worth of loan, the bank would hold both of you accountable and responsible for that property. And so it's not that, each one of you, gives takes away $200,000 worth of debt and the total together becomes 400. In the bank's eyes, if it's person A and person B, person A owns $400,000, owes $400,000, person B owes $400,000. If person A disappears, person B pays. If person B disappears, person A pays. And so typically what the bank is doing is bank is almost blocking a serviceability of closer to about $800,000 in total, right? And so a lot of people don't think about this, and they only find out this sort of stuff when they go out to buy a property of their own. And then that's when the bank realizes, no, you already have a debt of 400. And, people are like, no, but I was only supposed to, contribute 200,000. And that's not how it typically works. And so while it's a good idea to combine forces, it's only good idea to combine forces where you have done something within your own personal capacity first, and the residual serviceability, it's what's left, is what you're trying to use now to combine forces. Okay. Understand that both of you needs to be in the similar life cycle of property investment journey when you're coming in together. Okay. A lot of the times what I see is there is one person who has a lot of assets already and their borrowing capacity is only like, say, $200,000. And then there is one person who can borrow up to, say, $800,000. And they both combining together to buy a property for 800, thinking that it's divided for 400 and 400. And the next thing this person A, who had bigger serviceability, is basically is held accountable for the full $800,000 loan. And the other person who has a lot of debts and has a serviceability and has the portfolio already gets look sort of free kick because, he's only, putting in $200,000 typically, right? Because he didn't even have the serviceability in the first place. So it's important to start off at the equitable position and think about this as a long-term gig, not a short-term gig, as to how you're going to grow to get the portfolio together. And it would be really, really hard to split the portfolio in the next sort of 2 to 3 years, as you're growing this property portfolio. The second thing is use proper structures. Don't just go about doing this in your own personal name. A lot of people do this sort of crazy, silly mistakes of doing it in your personal name. At least if you do it in proper structures, you can come out of that structure very quickly and hand it over to someone else, or, depart ways, or, sell off your share to someone else, etc. And it provides you that flexibility, without selling the asset, triggering capital gains, etc., all of those things too. And so having the right structure in bringing these deals together when you're buying it with a family or a relative is quite important and quite the key. The last one, which is also very, very important, is understanding the tax implications out of things too, as to how this is going to be divided and how this is going to be serviced, right? A key example that I'll share with you is, I know 2 people went into a deal where they were building houses and selling them, and so they said, okay, we are going to buy a land, build a house, sell. One person had the serviceability, one person had the cash. The person who had the cash gave away the cash to the person who had the serviceability. So he built a house and he sold it in their personal name. And so typically what happens is all the profits come in his own personal profile because it's not a company setup. And so any money that he's giving in his head is basically, happening in his own profile, right? They don't have a business setup. They're not running it through ABN. And so from his perspective, any money that he's giving, from a tax perspective, any money he's giving to someone else is off as disposable income as a gift, right? There is no business expenses per se, or he's returning the loan. And so there needs to be a corporate agreement in place or a JV agreement in place that dictates this. And it would potentially need to be done under an ABN because there were GST complications around this. And so we had to almost go back and re-register his GST, open his ABN in a backdate, so that, he can claim and manage some of these things so that he's not up for a big tax bill at the very end. So understanding some of these little nitty-gritties around, how do you come together in dealing these things? While it's a great idea, it's important to, bypass some of these, I call them, the blow-up mines, that have been laid around as you're doing some of these partnerships.
And then there are 2 other things to be aware of. Well, actually, there's 3. One is how you're structuring the ownership of that property. There's things called tenants in common, where you basically or got joint tenancies. So that really depends on whether you've got 50-50 ownership, or you've got, with 70-30 ownership. So really important that you're across and are aware what that impact is. And the second thing is, obviously, things in your life change when you want to sell, how to navigate that process. And you might go, well, every 2 years we'll see, if we hold or we sell, but we need to come up with some sort of agreement that says, well, if one person wants and the other one doesn't, how do we deal with that situation? And if the other person does want to sell, how do we deal with that situation in terms of going, what's the value of that? What's the value of that side? And be aware, because you are transferring some level of ownership, there may be stamp duty implications.
And the last one to cover this topic of completely is, more around guarantors. People tend to use their parents or their grandparents or money available through inheritance, etc., to provide for their first-home buyers as well, right? And so that's a tricky, slippery slope as well when you're talking about guarantees, especially from people who are ready to retire or about to retire, and they're putting their name up to someone else's asset that, or a loan that they're going to guarantee. Understand that guarantee means that, you are literally, handing away your personal assets or assets under your own personal name against the thing that you're guaranteeing, be it the trust or, another purchase. And so it's important to understand the risks around guarantees. I always say to people, instead of providing, raw guarantees, extract the money out and give the money so that, there is a clean cutoff as to how much can you lose, rather than providing an unlimited guarantee to a loan. Because, again, yes, he or she is your kid and, you want your kids to succeed. But what you don't want to do is, them to turn around and basically cause you more strife. There is a very key story that I wanted to share here is when you talk about guarantees, understand that when you're providing a guarantee to your kids and the kids are in a relationship, and if the relationship breaks, they take away a percentage of whatever, right? Based on their asset breakdown or asset division that takes place within their family. And so if you have provided guarantees into those assets, typically you are exposing a lot from your perspective in that guarantee, right? So it's important to understand, especially if you're using your super while you're at your preservation age or something like that, it's important that you limit that. And so hand over the cash as a gift rather than providing blanket guarantees in a lot of these circumstances.
Yeah. And get financial advice.
Yes, of course.
Before you do any of these things and get all carried away and excited, I think it's really, really important because guarantors are parents or their later part of their lives. So it's really important that we are aware of how to preserve their wealth as well. Okie dokie. So we've talked about buying properties with friends, relatives. Next stage of life.
It's a good segue to you getting married, right? So getting married changes the dynamics for the good and bad at the same time, right? Good in a way that, it could be that he or she is working, and, you're getting a boost in the serviceability because now there is two incomes working together. And so your investment portfolio can really grow on steroids. It could be bad as well, typically where, she comes in with a lot of debt, or he or she again comes in with a lot of debt. And again, the debt basically is assessed between the two people as well at the same time, similar to the income that is assessed between the two people at the same time. Sometimes it adds, dependent, if you have marriage expenses that are coming through or trailing through your account, the banks would pick those up and see that, there is a lot of activity there, and they can push your discretionary expenses up, giving you, lower serviceability. So it's important to understand how much do you need to disclose to the bank. I've seen scenarios where people are planning to get married and, they would be like, oh, I'll buy a house under my name and she's going to buy a house under her name before, we put the names together to each other. And so there is all sorts of these stories where you hear all the time where people are trying to maximize their serviceability before they come together and then push it further up, when they come together at the same time.
Yeah. And when you're married and you're in, well, not even when you're married, when you're in a long-term relationship and legally that's what the law looks at. What do they call?
De facto partnership.
That's the word I was looking for. Yes. So you don't necessarily have to get married, but you're in a long-term relationship. So what the implications are in terms of that, particularly if you're purchasing property together.
De facto is an interesting one, right? Because typically, from a law side of things, you are almost like a married couple. But from bank side of things, you're not, because there's nothing in writing in paper that puts A and B together in a single house, right? So it's your word against someone else's. And so it's about how much information do you share. Of course, legally you have to, but there's a lot of gray area in a lot of these things. And again, these don't constitute this as financial advisor, tax advisor, financial planning advisor. Take a lot of this words that we are saying with a grain of salt or a bag of salt, probably. But it's important how much do you attribute your life to the bank as well. So yeah.
And I feel this time in your life, if you're possibly a double income, no children, it really is the best time to be able to leverage your serviceability and grow your portfolios, and think long term. Particularly if you're expecting to have children in future, because here's the next part: when you have kids, what does that do to your serviceability? As beautiful as they are, the bank goes, they're expensive little beep beep beep, right?
100%.
And so serviceability then from a banking perspective, what have you seen, Moss, in terms of serviceability when someone has children and someone doesn't have children? How much does that impact someone?
So that's an interesting question, right? Every time a kid comes into the picture, the kid takes away almost $100,000 to $150,000 worth of your serviceability away from, them coming into the world. Of course, it's a blessing, but it definitely stops you from pushing your ambitions into the investment world. And, two individuals coming in together pushes the serviceability up. The kid coming into the picture basically takes the serviceability away. Every kid who is dependent takes the serviceability away, typically because your discretionary expenses in the bank's eyes goes up quite significantly. And so they use that discretionary expenses to basically pull down your serviceability as the kid grows older and older, they're going to school, etc., all of those things. And so it's important to understand, especially like all the way before going to mat leave, you have opportunities to acquire properties, and you should, if you have the serviceability available, you should use that if you have that decision point in your life, because you know that decision point would disappear and you would not get that opportunity. Of course, take caution. Don't use all your buffers because you want to ensure that you're giving a beautiful life to the kid as well. And so don't just use everything that you have, and then the next thing you know, that the kids come into the world and you've invested everything and you're paper rich but not cash rich. But it's important to balance that out with making the right investment decisions as well.
Yeah, and it's just part of the planning. Again, if you go back to when you become a couple and you want to plan ahead, if someone is going to be out of work for a long period of time, you want to be able to have some level of additional income that gives you choices, right? If you're able to plan it out and put yourself in a position where you've got enough income that supplements your partner's wage and allows them either the flexibility of staying home for longer or whichever, that's part of your property strategy. So again, important to be able to be thinking long-term goals, come up with a strategy, because the worst thing is to, you have kids and you have to make that decision of, and if you really want to stay home, I'm talking about mum or dad, doesn't matter, right? It's like, but you feel that you don't have enough of the income, and then you've got to put them in childcare. But if you earn too much, then you don't get the childcare subsidy. It's a really yucky place to be in to make those sorts of decisions. So if you can already plan ahead and have that additional income coming through, it's going to just make life easier for you. If you're past that, you've got kids, doesn't mean it's the end of the world. We're just saying, at different parts of your life, just make sure you've got these options available for you.
Yes. And like having kids doesn't mean that you can't invest, right? That's not the message that we are giving. It's just that, plan accordingly so that you can make better decisions and use that to your advantage. You can maximize your borrowing, your serviceability, and make better decisions or plan better decisions upfront, being a bit more proactive around some of these things.
Absolutely. And the purpose of us sharing this is like, we've been through this. We've seen people go through it, and you can't help but go, if I'd done it again, I would have done it with the knowledge that I have. I might have done it differently or the same or whatever that might be. So it's really about, depending on where you are in your life, being able to just take these into account.
Thank you for listening to the first episode for key life decisions that are going to impact your serviceability, your property investment life cycle, or property investment decisions. Now, there is part 2 to this, which is information packed around not just marriage and having kids, but also changing jobs. What does that mean if you are changing from one industry to another, or you are going from PAYG income earner to an ABN income earner, or a sole trader to running a business? How does that impact your property investment journey? We're also going to talk about getting cars, getting unsecured personal loans, putting kids through private school, student loans, study loans, moving overseas, downsizing, all of this fun stuff. And how do you navigate through all of these things while managing and growing your property investment lifecycle or property investment strategy? Stay tuned. Thank you for listening to us today.